Let's talk about memory. We tend to think of it as something that happens up here in our brains, right? But what if I told you that memory isn't just for brains? What if every single cell in your body is keeping a record of its past? Well, let's dive into this because we're about to explore a pretty radical idea that challenges one of the biggest assumptions in all of biology. This very question was posed decades ago by the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist Barbara McClintock. Back then, it sounded way more like philosophy than actual science. She talked about seeing plant cells respond in a thoughtful manner to stress in ways that were just, beyond what science could explain at the time. Turns out, she was really onto something huge. For the longest time, the story of memory seemed pretty simple. It lived in the brain. You've probably heard the saying, neurons that fire together, wire together. That was the whole game. But a totally different view is starting to take hold. One that suggests memory is a fundamental property of all life, where every single cell can record its experiences to better survive what's coming next. Now, to really get this, you have to try and think like a cell. Its entire world is basically the warm darkness inside a body, and its experience is just this constant river of chemical signals, hormones, nutrients, messages from its neighbors. From that point of view, memory isn't some abstract idea. It's just how a cell is physically changed by these patterns over time. Okay, so here's what's really wild about all this. This idea, it's not actually new at all. In fact, it's a rediscovery of research that was totally dismissed and then forgotten for almost 100 years. We're about to meet some of the forgotten pioneers of cellular memory. Let's hop in a time machine and go back to 1906. This is zoologist Herbert Spencer Jennings, and he came up with this incredibly simple but elegant experiment. He took this little single-celled organism, Stentor russelii, which just hangs out in freshwater ponds, and he basically decided to annoy it with a drop of dye, just to see what it would do. And what he saw was this really clear, predictable sequence of events. First, the cell would try to just bend away from the irritating stuff. If that didn't work, its second move was to use its tiny little hairs, its cilia, to try and spit water to push the dye away. And if that still failed, step 3, it would just contract sharply into its base and hide. A simple 3-step defense. Okay, so Jennings figured out the cell's basic playbook. But the real test, the question that really mattered, was what would the cell do next? After it relaxed and came back out, if he annoyed it again, would it remember what happened before? And this is the amazing part. It learned. It totally learned. When he hit it with the dye again, the cell didn't even bother with bending or spitting. Nope, it went straight to the most effective defense, contracting. As Jennings himself wrote, the cell was, quote, changed by the experiences it has passed through. This was real evidence of memory in a single cell, more than a century ago. So, why isn't this in every single biology textbook? Well, because the scientific establishment at the time just couldn't wrap their heads around it. The work of Jennings and another pioneer named Beatrice Gelber, who showed that paramecia could be conditioned just like Pavlov's dogs, it was all dismissed. Then, in the 60s, a really slobby attempt to reproduce Jennings' work failed because they used the wrong species of organism. And that was it. The whole idea of cellular memory got buried, until it was finally vindicated in 2019. All right, let's jump forward to today. Let's see how modern molecular biology finally found the smoking gun that proves these early pioneers were right all along. This gets us to something you've definitely experienced yourself. It's called the spacing effect. It's the whole reason why cramming for a test the night before is way less effective than studying a little bit each day. It's a universal rule for memory in animals, and a neuroscientist named Nikolai Kukushkin started to wonder, could that same rule apply to a single cell? So he set up this really clever experiment. He took human kidney cells, not neurons, kidney cells, in a dish and exposed them to chemical signals. Now, to actually see if the cells were remembering, he used a special gene that would literally glow when a memory was being formed. The brighter and longer the glow, the stronger the memory. And the results were just stunning. Check this out. When he gave the cells one big cram session of chemical signals, they formed a memory, sure, but it only lasted for a few hours. But when he delivered the exact same total amount of chemicals, but in short, spaced-out pulses, the memory glowed for over a day. It was undeniable proof of the spacing effect in cells that have absolutely nothing to do with the brain. This discovery led Kukushkin to a conclusion that is totally radical. He thinks we've been looking at it all wrong.
He says we should assume that memory is the default state for all cells. The burden of proof, he argues, isn't on showing that a kidney cell can remember. It's on showing that it can't.
Right. So this is the heart of the matter. All this new evidence, it forces us to take a step back and ask a really basic question. What even is memory? Maybe our old brain-focused definition has been holding us back this whole time. So traditionally, science has defined memory by behavior. It's a change in what an organism does based on what happened to it before, like the ciliate contracting, right? You have to see an action to prove there's a memory. But this new research points to a different definition, a molecular one. Memory is simply the physical mark left behind by an experience. It could be a chemical tweak or what's called an epigenetic mark, which is basically a tiny molecular switch that can turn genes on or off depending on what the cell has gone through. To see why this difference in definition is so important, let's do a little thought experiment with this guy, the California sea hare. Neuroscientists love this slug because its neurons are gigantic, and its memory is super easy to track. You give it a little shock, and it flinches. Simple. So if you shock it, and then later you shock it again and it flinches more, that's your behavioral proof that it remembers the first shock. But what happens if you take those neurons out and put them in a petri dish? All the physical molecular changes from that shock are still there. But without a body, the neurons can't behave. They can't make anything flinch. So is the memory gone? Of course not. The memory isn't gone. The physical record is still there. Which leads to this incredible idea. Maybe what we've been calling a mechanism for memory, all those molecular marks and changes, maybe that's not just the process. Maybe that is the memory itself. And that's a definition that works for a single kidney cell just as well as it does for an entire brain. Okay, so let's pull all this together. What are the big implications here? What does it really mean for science and for us if every single one of our cells can remember? So what are the big takeaways from all this? Well, first, memory is ancient. It's an evolutionary tool that existed for hundreds of millions of years before brains ever came along. Second, science doesn't always move in a straight line. Huge ideas can be lost, forgotten, and then rediscovered. And finally, maybe we need a much bigger definition of memory, any physical trace of the past. Under that definition, a scar on your skin is a memory, and so is a tiny molecular change deep inside a cell. It's really a powerful metaphor when you think about it. By finding the lost work of pioneers like Jennings and Gelber, it feels like the whole field of biology is waking up from its own 50-year spell of amnesia. And thankfully, those old, important memories are flooding back. And that leaves us with one last, pretty mind-bending thought to take away. If every single cell in your body is a living archive, a physical record of its own unique past, then what kind of story is your body telling right now?